All right, welcome back everyone for part 2 of our deep dive into modern Indian history, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC exams and, of course, all you history enthusiasts out there.
Yeah, great to be back.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And, if you're enjoying this journey through India's past, it really does help others discover the show.
Right.
So last time we were talking about all the revolutionary activities brewing across India and that call for self-governance. It was just getting louder and louder every day.
Right.
The big question was, how would the British respond to this mounting pressure?
Yeah.
Could they just ignore it, or would they be forced to change their approach?
It was a real turning point for sure.
And that's where this thing called the August Declaration of 1917 comes in.
Yeah.
It was this major policy shift delivered by Edwin Samuel Montagu. And let me tell you, it sent shockwaves through India.
Huge moment.
So can you kind of set the stage for us? What was the situation like in India just before this declaration?
Well, World War I had just ended, and, that had a huge impact on India. Indians had contributed so much to the war effort, both in terms of manpower and resources.
Right.
And this led to a surge in nationalistic feelings and this kind of growing expectation that their sacrifices would be met with greater political rights.
It's almost like, they had earned it in a way.
Exactly.
All
And
right.
then you had the rise of all these revolutionary activities. Groups like the Ghadar Party were advocating for complete independence, even if it meant using armed struggle.
Wow.
So you had this kind of internal pressure building up.
So the British were facing pressure from both sides.
Hmm.
On the one hand, you had Indians demanding more rights. And then on the other hand, you had these groups pushing for complete independence. It must have been a really difficult situation for them.
Oh, absolutely. They were trying to maintain control, but the ground was shifting beneath their feet.
So that's where Montagu and his August Declaration come into the picture.
Right. Yes. The August Declaration was essentially the British response to all of this pressure that was building up. It was their attempt to address the growing demands for self-governance.
Okay, so let's dive into the declaration itself. What were some of the key elements? What did it actually say?
Well, at its heart, the Declaration stated the British government's intention to increase Indian participation in their own government.
Oh, okay, so they were willing to give up some power.
Well, to some extent, the idea was to gradually develop self-governing institutions with the ultimate goal of achieving responsible government for India, but still within the British Empire.
Within the British Empire. So not complete independence.
Not yet, no. This was a very carefully worded declaration. It was meant to appease Indian aspirations while still maintaining British control.
It sounds like they were trying to walk a very fine line, trying to give just enough to quell the unrest, but not so much that they lost their grip on power.
Absolutely, it was a balancing act. And it didn't really satisfy many Indian nationalists.
I can imagine. So this whole idea of responsible government, what did that actually mean back then?
That's a great question, because the meaning was actually quite vague. In this context, responsible government basically meant a system where the Indian government would be answerable to elected representatives, not just to the British Crown.
So it was like a step towards more democracy.
In a way, yes. It was a shift towards giving Indians more say in running their own affairs, but it was still very much under the umbrella of British rule.
It's interesting how even the language they used was so calculated.
Oh, definitely. They were masters of wordsmithing.
So we've talked about the context leading up to the declaration, and now we've looked at the declaration itself. But I think what's really important to understand is how this declaration was received. How did people react to it?
Yeah, that's crucial. And as you can imagine, the reactions were mixed. Some people saw it as a positive step, a sign that the British were finally starting to listen to Indian demands.
Right.
But many others, and this includes many Indian nationalist leaders, were highly critical of the declaration. They felt it didn't go far enough. They saw it as too little too late.
So what were some of their specific concerns?
One of the biggest issues was the lack of a clear timeline for this responsible government that they were promising.
So it was like a promise with no deadline.
Exactly. It left Indians wondering how long this gradual process would actually take. And many felt that the British were just stalling for time.
It's like saying, yeah, sure, we'll give you a promotion sometime. Maybe. Not very reassuring.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And then you had prominent figures like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who famously called the reforms unworthy and disappointing, a sunless dawn.
A sunless dawn. That's such a powerful image.
He felt that it fell far short of what India deserved, and many agreed with him.
So it sounds like there was a lot of skepticism and even anger towards this declaration.
Definitely. there's this feeling that the British were still trying to dictate the terms of India's future, that they weren't really listening to what Indians actually wanted.
Almost like they were saying, we'll decide when and how you get to govern yourselves.
Precisely.
Right.
And that didn't sit well with many Indians.
So even though this August Declaration was a major policy shift, it seems like it created more problems than it solved.
In a way, yes. It exposed the deep divisions between the British rulers and the Indian people. It highlighted the growing demand for self-rule, but it also showed how reluctant the British were to truly relinquish control.
It was a turning point, but not in the way that many had hoped.
Right. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the struggle for independence, but it was a chapter filled with challenges and uncertainties.
So this is just the beginning of the story.
Yeah,
right?
We're just getting started.
There's so much more to unpack and explore in the coming years leading up to India's eventual independence.
Absolutely. The August Declaration was just the first domino to fall.
And it's fascinating to see how one declaration could trigger such a chain of events.
It's a reminder that even small actions can have huge consequences, especially when it comes to matters of freedom and self-determination.
So for our listeners who are eager to learn more about this pivotal period in Indian history, and especially those prepping for the UPSC exams, we're going to continue our deep dive in the next episode where we'll delve into the aftermath of the August Declaration. We'll explore the impact it had on the Indian nationalist movement, the key players who emerged, and the events that ultimately shaped India's path to independence. So stay tuned and we'll be right back.
You know, it's important to remember that this August Declaration, it wasn't just some isolated event.
Right.
It was a product of all these different forces kind of converging at this specific moment in history.
Right. We need to zoom out a little bit and see how it fits into the broader context of India's fight for independence.
Exactly. So World War I had just, shaken the world, and that had a profound impact on India.
Yeah.
Indians had contributed hugely to the war effort, both in terms of manpower and resources.
Right.
And this, led to this surge in nationalistic feelings and a growing expectation that, their sacrifices would be met with greater political rights.
It's almost like this feeling of, we fought for you, now it's time to give us what we deserve.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, you had the rise of all these revolutionary activities. Groups like the Ghadar Party were advocating for complete independence, even if it meant using armed struggle.
Wow. So they were really pushing the boundary.
Oh, yeah. And even though the British tried to suppress these movements, they were a constant reminder that things were changing. The desire for freedom was growing stronger and stronger.
Right. So the British were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. They had all this pressure from within India, but they also had to deal with a changing world order after the war.
Exactly. The war had weakened Britain's global standing, and they were starting to realize that, they couldn't just ignore the demands of their colonies anymore.
So do you think that the August Declaration was a way for the British to kind of try to calm things down in India?
Oh, I think so. It was definitely an attempt to address the growing unrest, but at the same time, they still wanted to hold on to as much control as possible.
Right. So how did these pressures, both internal and external, actually shape the content of the Declaration? I mean, what were they thinking when they drafted this thing?
Well, take the emphasis on gradualism, for example. This idea that self-rule would be granted slowly over time. That was a direct response to the pressure they were facing. They were willing to give up some power, but only on their own terms.
It sounds like they were trying to buy themselves some time, hoping that maybe the situation would calm down and they wouldn't have to give up too much.
Yeah, I think there was definitely an element of that. And then there's the introduction of dyarchy, with this division of power.
Right.
We talked about that earlier.
That was another part of their strategy. It was a way to give Indians a taste of self-governance, but without really relinquishing control over the most important areas.
Right. It was a compromise, but not one that really satisfied Indian nationalists.
No, not really. It was too little, too slow for many.
So in the end, do you think this August Declaration was a success or a failure? I mean, did it achieve what the British intended? That's a really interesting question. I think in the short term, it perhaps bought them some time. It created this sense of hope that things were moving in the right direction.
Right.
But in the long run, it actually had the opposite effect.
Really?
Yeah. By acknowledging the demand for self-rule, even in this limited way, they legitimized the movement. It gave Indian nationalists a powerful argument to rally around.
It's like they accidentally gave the movement a shot in the arm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And once the genie was out of the bottle, there was no putting it back in.
So it's a bit of a miscalculation on their part.
You could say that what we're seeing here is that the August Declaration wasn't just about a change in policy. It was a reflection of this much bigger shift that was happening on a global scale.
Yeah.
You know, the slow dismantling of colonial power structures.
And this is what makes it such an important topic for our listeners who are preparing for the UPSC exams, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Exactly. It's about understanding these complex forces at play, how global power dynamics, the legacy of colonialism, the aspirations of a nation all came together at this moment, and how that shaped the future of India.
Right, it's about seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And for those of us who just find history fascinating, it's a reminder that history is full of these kind of, fascinating turning points where what might seem like small decisions or declarations can have this ripple effect across generations, changing the course of entire nations.
So even though this happened over 100 years ago, it's still relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The themes that we're talking about here, power, freedom, self-determination, these are all themes that are still very much alive today.
Right. So the August Declaration wasn't just a moment in time, it was a catalyst for change.
Exactly. It set in motion a process that would eventually lead to the end of the British Empire in India.
Okay, so we've talked about the Declaration itself, the context behind it, and how it was received. But there's still this bigger question that I think is lingering in our listeners' minds.
Yeah.
So how did this declaration, with, all its shortcomings and all the mixed reactions, how did it actually push India closer to independence?
Well, you see, by actually stating that, responsible government was the goal, the August Declaration really changed the whole conversation. Before it was about if India, should be self-governing, now it became about how and when it would actually happen.
It was like the British admitted that they were going to lose the game eventually,
Yeah.
but they still wanted to, control how fast the game was played.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, that strategy really backfired.
Okay.
Because by saying out loud that, self-rule was the goal, they gave the Indian independence movement this huge boost.
Right.
It gave them this powerful moral and political argument to rally around.
It's almost like they accidentally injected the movement with adrenaline.
Exactly. They legitimized the very thing that they were trying to control. Wow.
And it didn't stop there. The declaration led to, this surge of political action in India.
Oh, okay.
New leaders came to the forefront, new strategies were developed, and the demand for full independence became louder and more insistent with each passing year.
It's like once that genie was out of the bottle, there was no putting it back in.
Exactly.
Right.
The August Declaration, for all its limitations, really set in motion this process that would lead to the end of the British Empire in India.
Okay. So we've established that this was a major turning point.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the only factor that led to India's independence, was it?
Of course not. The Indian independence movement was this complex tapestry woven from many threads. You had social reformers, religious leaders, intellectuals, revolutionaries, everyday men and women. They all played a role.
Yeah. It was a true people's movement, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the impact of huge events like the non-cooperation movement, the civil disobedience movement, the Quit India movement. Each one of those, put immense pressure on the British and brought them closer to the day they would actually leave India.
So the August Declaration was kind of like a spark that lit a much larger fire.
Yeah.
It provided the fuel, but it was the will of the people that kept it burning.
I think that's a perfect analogy. Yeah. It provided that initial momentum, but it was really the dedication and sacrifice of countless Indians that finally brought about the dawn of freedom.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this period in Indian history.
Yeah.
But it's given us a lot to think about.
There's always more to explore.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
The August Declaration was a product of its time, a moment when, the world was changing dramatically, but it also raises some questions that are still relevant today.
Like what kind of questions?
Well, think about it. How do we find the right balance between people's desire for, self-determination and the need for stability and order? How do we ensure that everyone's voice is heard and respected when big political changes are happening? These are challenges that we're still wrestling with, both in India and around the world.
That's a great point. History isn't just about the past, is it?
Right.
It's about understanding the forces that shape our world today and the choices that we face as we move into the future.
So for all of you listening out there, especially those of you preparing for the UPSC exams, keep digging deeper. Keep asking those questions and keep making those connections between the past and the present.
Yeah.
As you delve into modern Indian history, remember that every event, every declaration is ultimately a story about people, their struggles, their hopes, and their triumphs. And those are the stories that make history truly come alive.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to more resources on this topic. There's a whole world of information out there waiting to be explored.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the August Declaration of 1917. We hope you learned something new and exciting today. Make sure to subscribe and like the show, and we'll be back soon with more deep dives into fascinating historical moments. Until then, keep exploring the past.